My mother-in-law fed my 4-year-old 3 cupcakes and a soda at 8 p.m., then texted me a photo captioned "Our Little Secret," the same week I'd asked her, in writing, to stop overriding our bedtime rules. I let it go, the way I'd let a dozen small things go before. 4 days later, the babysitter told me something that changed that. This is still waters. Here's what she wrote. I'm Frankie, 34. My husband Silas and I have a son, Theo, who's 4, sweet and stubborn in the specific combination that makes consistency matter more than it would for an easier kid. Silas's mother, Loretta, lives 20 minutes away and watches Theo 2 afternoons a week while Silas and I both work. A genuine help, one I was grateful for, right up until it started costing us more than it saved. Theo was a difficult sleeper from the very beginning, the kind of baby who needed the exact same sequence every night to settle. Bath, 2 books, same song, lights out by 7:30, or the whole evening unraveled into hours of overtired crying that neither he nor we could recover from easily. We didn't arrive at that routine casually. It came out of a genuinely hard first 18 months. A pediatric sleep consultant we paid out of pocket for because our insurance didn't cover it, and a level of exhausted trial and error that made consistency feel less like a parenting philosophy and more like the only thing standing between us and complete collapse. That history is part of why Loretta's version of "let him be a kid" landed so much harder than it might have with an easier kid. She wasn't just relaxing an arbitrary rule. She was undoing something we'd fought hard to build. The undermining didn't start big. It started with dessert before dinner, just this once, which became most Tuesdays, which became Loretta keeping a drawer of candy at her house, specifically for Theo, unprompted, unmentioned to us. It moved into screen time. Our rule was 1 show after dinner. Loretta's version was whatever keeps him happy, which in practice meant tablets from the moment he walked in her door. When I gently raised it, the first few times, Loretta would say some version of, "He's 4, Frankie. Let him be a kid," in a tone that made the rule sound like something I'd invented to make everyone's life harder. Silas's older sister, Dana, had gone through something similar years earlier with her own kids, back when they were toddlers, and warned me early on, half joking, that Loretta treats every rule as a suggestion the moment the parents leave the room. I remember laughing it off at the time, telling her Theo was different. Our situation was different, mostly because I didn't want to start a relationship with my mother-in-law already braced for conflict. I think about that conversation with Dana a lot now, mostly because she was right, and I'd assumed my own optimism counted for more than her actual experience. For a long stretch, I told myself the stakes were small enough to let go. Sugar and screen time are survivable, even if they're not what I'd choose. What made it harder to dismiss was the pattern underneath the specifics. Every time I set a boundary with Loretta directly, she'd agree warmly in the moment, and then quietly do the opposite the very next time she had Theo alone, as if the conversation itself had been the entire point, a box checked rather than an actual agreement. The bedtime issue was the one that actually mattered, because Theo has never slept well, and a late sugar crash plus screen time before bed meant nights of him up until 11, cranky and overstimulated, for days afterward. I asked Loretta directly, kindly, more than once, to stick to our routine on the days she watched him. She'd agree in the moment, and then do exactly what she wanted the next time, which I only knew because Theo would tell me things. Grandma said we don't have to do the boring bedtime at her house. In the specific proud tone of a kid repeating a rule he'd been given permission to break. I started keeping a loose mental tally of the Tuesday and Thursday nights she watched him, comparing how he slept those nights against nights he'd spent with a regular sitter or with us. The difference was consistent enough that I finally wrote it down properly. 6 weeks of bedtimes, actual clock times he fell asleep, cross-referenced with who'd had him that evening. On Loretta's days, he was averaging bedtime past 10. On every other day, closer to 8:15, exactly where it was supposed to be. Silas saw the numbers and admitted, quietly, that he'd noticed Theo seemed off after time with his mom, but had chalked it up to normal kid variability, rather than anything specific she was doing. The photo came on a Wednesday. Loretta, smiling, Theo with chocolate frosting on his face at 8 at night. Caption, "Our little secret. Don't tell mom LOL." I didn't respond right away. I sat with it, because I could feel myself wanting to fire off something I'd regret, and I've learned that regret texts don't actually fix anything. They just give the other person something to be defensive about, instead of something to think about. What actually pushed me from frustrated to done wasn't the cupcakes. It was 4 days later, when our regular evening babysitter, Marisol, mentioned, casually, not even realizing it was information, that Loretta had stopped by unannounced during her shift the week before, let herself in with the spare key we'd given her for emergencies only, and told Marisol she didn't need to worry about the schedule tonight. Grandma's got it. Before taking Theo out for ice cream past his bedtime on a school night, without telling Silas or me at all, Marisol assumed we knew. We didn't. That was the piece that reframed everything for me. This wasn't Loretta being an indulgent grandmother on her own 2 afternoons. It was Loretta using a spare key meant for emergencies to insert herself into evenings that weren't hers, actively working around our actual childcare arrangement and coaching our 4-year-old to keep it from us. Our little secret wasn't a throwaway phrase. It was the actual operating instruction. I asked Marisol gently if she'd be willing to just text me directly anytime Loretta came by unannounced going forward. Not to spy, just so I had an accurate picture of what was actually happening on nights I wasn't home. She said of course, and admitted she'd felt uncomfortable that night, but hadn't known whose authority to follow. Marisol also told me something I hadn't asked about directly, almost apologetically, like she wasn't sure it was her place. That Loretta had asked her that same evening not to mention the ice cream trip to us at all, framing it as not a big deal, no reason to make a thing of it. That was the detail that actually kept me up that night. It wasn't just that Loretta had overridden our schedule. It was that she'd specifically, deliberately, asked a third adult to help keep it from us, which meant this had stopped being an isolated lapse in judgment and become something closer to an ongoing, coordinated workaround. I asked Marisol carefully if this was the first time something like that had happened, and she hesitated before answering, which told me most of what I needed to know before she even said the words. She said there'd been 2 other evenings, smaller ones, where Loretta had called or texted her directly about small changes. Let him stay up a bit later if he wants. It's fine if he skips the bath tonight. Always framed casually enough that Marisol hadn't felt she could refuse without seeming difficult. And always, she now realized looking back, without either of us ever being told. That conversation with Marisol took almost 40 minutes. Most of it her walking through her own discomfort at being caught between 2 adults she liked and respected, unsure whose authority actually mattered in the moment. I told her none of this was her fault, that we should have given her clearer instructions from the start about exactly this kind of situation, and that the gap in communication was ours to fix, not hers to keep quietly managing on her own. I didn't bring this to Silas as an accusation against his mother. I brought it to him as a timeline: the candy, the screen time, the coached secrecy, and now an unauthorized use of the emergency key to override paid childcare on a school night. I laid it out the way I'd want someone to lay out a problem to me, with dates, not adjectives. Silas went quiet for a long time reading through it. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I think I've been letting this go because pushing back on my mom always turns into a whole thing, and it was easier to let you be the one who minded. That was its own small reckoning, but it moved us to the same page fast. We changed 3 things: in writing, in a message Silas sent his mother directly. First, the spare key came back. Loretta would need to call ahead like anyone else. No unannounced visits during a sitter's shift. Second, any deviation from our stated rules, food, screen time, bedtime, needed to be discussed with us in advance, not decided unilaterally and then hidden from Theo's other caregivers. Third, and this was the one Loretta actually reacted to, if Theo ever again described something as a secret from mom and dad, her afternoons with him would pause while we figured out a different arrangement. Loretta's response wasn't tears, the way I'd braced for. It was indignation. She told Silas that she'd raised 3 kids without anyone micromanaging her, that this was what grandmothers did, that I was turning a normal, loving relationship into a legal contract. Silas told her calmly that the issue wasn't sugar or screens. Those were survivable. It was that she'd taught his son to keep things from his parents, and that was the one line that wasn't negotiable, regardless of how anyone felt about bedtime rules. Loretta pushed back a second time, a few days later, calling me directly instead of going through Silas, telling me she thought I was punishing her for loving Theo too much, that some daughters-in-law would be grateful for a grandmother this involved. I told her I was grateful for her involvement. I'd never once asked her to love him less or see him less, and that the entire conversation had never been about how much she loved him. It was about a spare key used without asking, and a 4-year-old told to keep a secret from his own parents. She didn't have a response to that specific pairing of facts, which was the first time in the whole conversation she went quiet instead of arguing back. She tried one more angle before the call ended, bringing up how she'd raised Silas and his 2 siblings largely on her own after his father left when Silas was 6, that nobody had handed her a rule book then, and everything had turned out fine. I told her I understood that history mattered to how she saw herself as a mother, and now a grandmother, and that I wasn't questioning whether she'd done a good job with her own kids decades ago. What I was asking for was much smaller than a referendum on her whole parenting history, just for her to respect 2 specific current rules in a house that wasn't hers, and to stop coaching a 4-year-old to hide things from the 2 people actually responsible for him. Silas, to his credit, backed me up fully on that call, on speaker, adding his own piece at the end, that he'd spent his whole childhood learning to read his mother's moods and manage her feelings before his own, and that he didn't want Theo growing up doing the same thing with secrets standing in for real communication. That landed harder with Loretta than anything I'd said, I think, because it came from her own son instead of from me. The key came back within the week. The unannounced visits stopped. What took longer was Theo. For about a month, he tested us, asking if things could be our secret the way Grandma's things used to be. And each time we told him, plainly, that we don't keep secrets from each other in our family. That if someone tells you not to tell Mom or Dad something, that's exactly the thing you should tell us. It's language I never expected to need to give a 4-year-old, and it worked, slowly. We also talked to Marisol about how to handle it if Loretta ever asked her to keep something quiet again. A clear rule: nothing improvised in the moment. Anything involving a change to schedule, food, or safety gets a text to us immediately. No exceptions, regardless of who's asking or how casually they frame it. Marisol seemed almost relieved to have it spelled out, since she'd spent that first uncomfortable evening improvising her own judgment call with no actual guidance from either side of the family. Dana, Silas's sister, called me a few weeks after everything settled, not quite apologizing, but coming close, saying she wished she'd pushed harder when she first warned me, instead of leaving it as a half joke I could brush off easily. I told her I didn't think there was a version of that warning I would have taken fully seriously before I had my own evidence in front of me. Some things you have to see the pattern of yourself before someone else's experience actually lands. Dana told me something else during that call that reframed a lot of the earlier years for me. That she'd eventually stopped letting Loretta watch her kids alone at all, quietly, without ever explaining why to the rest of the family, which is part of why I'd never heard the full story, growing distant enough to notice the pattern myself, until it was my own son involved. I asked her, gently, why she'd never told me directly instead of just the half-joke warning. She said it felt like the kind of thing you can't say plainly about someone's mother without it sounding like an attack. So she'd let the joke carry more weight than it could actually hold, hoping I'd read between the lines. I told her, honestly, that I probably needed her to just say it outright, the way I eventually had to say things outright to Loretta myself. Loretta and I aren't warm the way I'd once hoped we'd become, but she calls ahead now. She asks before deviating from anything, and Theo hasn't used the word secret about her house in months. Silas checks in with her boundaries now instead of quietly absorbing the friction himself, which changed more between the three of us than any single rule did. There was one afternoon, about 2 months in, where Loretta asked me directly, almost tentatively, whether Theo could have one cookie, just one, is that allowed, before doing anything, waiting for an actual answer instead of deciding on her own and hoping it went unnoticed. I said yes. It was such a small moment, and it meant more to me than I expected, not because of the cookie, but because she'd asked, out loud, before acting, for what I think was genuinely the first time since Theo was born. Theo's sleep is back to where it was before any of this started. Consistent bedtimes. No more mysterious cranky stretches after Loretta's afternoons. His pediatrician actually commented on it at his last checkup, noting how settled his sleep log looked compared to the version I'd nervously brought in 8 months earlier, back when I still thought the problem might be something medical rather than 2 grandparent hours a week quietly undoing everything we'd built. I don't think Loretta ever saw herself as working against us. I think she genuinely believed indulgence was love, and that our rules were obstacles to it, rather than the actual scaffolding Theo needed. Maybe both things were true. Either way, the secrecy was the part that couldn't stay, no matter how good her intentions were underneath it. Silas checks in with me now, unprompted, whenever his mom offers to take Theo somewhere unplanned. Not out of suspicion exactly, just a habit we built together once we understood what could quietly grow in the gaps we weren't watching. It's a small thing, a 2-line text before he says yes, but it's the difference between a family that talks and a family that just hopes nothing's happening behind closed doors. So here's what I keep wondering. How many kids are being taught, gently and lovingly, that the people who set the rules aren't the people who get told the truth? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. That's the whole story. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Still Waters. Thanks for listening.